Hello everybody, today I'm going to talk about these two books by Anatoly Fomenko, The Issue with British History and The Issue with the Mongols. Now I have made summary videos on all of the Anatoly Fomenko books that I have read so far, as well as Redating Ancient Greece by Sylvain Tristan. And actually I recommend that video first if that is the first video you were to watch in this series, but I will try to bring you up to speed as well. Now that I'm a few books in, things are making a lot more sense. Go back a few years ago on my channel and I was discovering that the word Tartar was basically interchangeable with the word Mongol in history books because I was hearing the word Tartar and Tartarian all the time. But I had heard that before in the history of Russia and other history books, and that's what they're saying, that Mongol is interchangeable with Tartar, and Fomenko does make this make more sense. And if you read these history books closely, you can see that they use a lot of terms interchangeably, including Mongol, Tartar, Cossack, but also words that are associated with Mongol, like Khan is completely interchangeable with Tsar, which is Russian, but it's all the same empire, both basically meaning great leader, which, by the way, Arabic was also one of the languages of this empire. The word Mongolian historically would likely mean the great. This is far before we assigned the word Mongol to mean people from Mongolia or a place called Mongolia. Those are both very recent inventions. So if you see in history the Mongolian Empire, that pretty much just means the Great Empire. And this makes sense because the Great Empire, the Tartarian Empire, was much more than just Mongolia. In fact, there were several separate nations that were part of this empire, and many of them carried the name Tartaria, Great Tartaria, Chinese Tartaria. Now this also makes sense because according to Fomenko, Tartar or Tartarian means warrior basically, as does the word Cossack. So when you see Tartarian or Cossack or even Mongol, right, this is just a person from the Mongolian Empire, the Great Empire, an empire which stretched all the way across Siberia, all the way down through Asia, all the way through the Middle East. This included the Ottoman Empire, Turkish people. So these people, a Tartar could be a Turk, they could be an Ottoman, they could be a Persian, they could be from China, they could be a Slavic person. Now the average person wouldn't know that the Mongolia that we call Mongolia now, those people didn't even know about Genghis Khan and all that stuff until Western scholars went and told them about that history, because Western scholars went to go and look for, the old cities, the old capitals of the Mongolian Empire, and they did not find anything within Mongolia, and they still haven't today. Because of the jumbling of history, it's just a mistake to look in Mongolia for these capitals. These capitals existed mostly in Russia and further south down to what we would call New Rome, Constantinople, Istanbul, Tsargrad, the City of the Kings. These are all the same place. So just keep that in mind. A Mongol or a Tartar or a Cossack, this could be a person or a soldier from many different nationalities speaking one of many different languages, and they could live anywhere from Siberia or Japan to the Mediterranean or Britain. So we have here on a large scale what Fomenko is calling phantom people or phantom events, phantom duplicates. And this means that people or events or places have been duplicated in different places in history. They've been written into different places in history. There's a whole bunch of different reasons for that. I do go in more into that in my other videos. And some of this is geographical, right? Names show up all over the place, all over the world. Rome is used all over the place. We think of Rome as in Italy, but New Rome is Constantinople. It would have been referred to as Rome or Byzantium. This would have been a later age of the Roman Empire in our regular mainstream history books. But Fomenko would contend that the usual suspect is that the most recent version of the person or the event or the empire, that's usually the real one, and the phantom duplicates are projected backwards in time. So you'd have event 1 closer to us and then event 2 further back, even though in the history books event 2 would come first. So you'd get the ancient Romans, and then they'd say, oh, there was a Dark Ages, and then the Roman Empire came back. Right now, remember, the Roman Empire also stretched to Britain. But what is the Roman Empire? Well, the Roman Empire is basically interchangeable with the Byzantine Empire. What is the Byzantine Empire? It's basically Ottoman. What's Ottoman? It's basically Tartarian, part of this gigantic empire. And so quite a lot of what we would see as ancient history would have actually been referring to events that happened in much more recent centuries, especially the 13th century onwards. And remember, the main period of the Mongolian Empire is the 1200s and 1300s, so the 13th and 14th centuries, which is also coincidentally when much of the history was beginning to be written from the 14th century onwards. This is what we would call the Renaissance period, basically. This is after a 1,000-year dark ages in architecture and art and in world history. We had big dark ages where afterwards much of ancient history started to repeat itself. Again, Fomenko's contention is that these ancient events are mostly projections of events from a more recent time, which is what we would call our period, this period that we're currently living in. And you really do have to read Fomenko's books to really understand the intricacies of the arguments for these duplicate characters and such. My summaries are not going to do that justice. We are taking that for granted here, basically. So if you do want that elaborated on, definitely buy the books. So now we've summed up quite a few terms, and this is going to allow our summary here to make a bit more sense. Understanding that a Byzantine Roman citizen could also be an Ottoman Turk at the exact same time, could also be a Mongolian, could also be a Tartar, could also be a Cossack, could be referred to in many different names, and the geographical locations where events in history are said to take place can change because the original event may have happened in one place and the phantom event can happen in a different part of the world, in a different century, when it's recorded in a history book. So what we're really looking at in this case with the British history is the expansion of the Mongolian Empire, which again is also basically the expansion of the Roman Empire, the Roman Empire closest to us, or the Tartarian Empire, or as Fomenko might call it, the Russian Empire, and we would all be correct. So let's jump into the British history, and let's remember that Britain ended up having its own empire, which stretched from sea to sea, and the sun never set on it, right? And also remember, or if you didn't see the earlier videos, that the Tartars, basically the last Tsar of Great Tartaria, was defeated in 1775. So pretty much everything after that, we can see empires shifting. And if you look at regular history, it looks like the whole world is kind of broken up into all these different kingdoms and little mini empires, and they're all fighting with each other. But if you step back a little bit, it seems to be much more like two very large empires themselves. Now, it was Petrarch that coined the phrase the Dark Ages, and that was in 1330 or the 1330s. That was right before the Black Death, the bubonic plague and all that. And pretty much after that is what we consider the High Renaissance. And after the Renaissance, we pretty much start to shift into the more modern period. And this does happen more or less in the 1700s there, which is, of course, as Fomenko says, the last major war between what he calls the Romanovs, but we can call the Europeans, between the Europeans and the Tartars, or the Mongols, or the Horde, many different names. But after that last defeat, and what I'm assuming is a series of wars, history really is taken over by the Europeans, and this is included with Britain, of course. Britain is a big part of history then onwards. Not so much before that. And by the way, the Dark Ages is a pretty mistaken term. Originally, it probably only referred to a couple of decades, maybe a couple of centuries, but most of us now are taking it to mean 1,000 years, and I actually do take it to mean about 1,000 years. And those Dark Ages seem to be more or less just made up. Doesn't seem to be real concrete history and manuscripts from that time period. All of the manuscripts, the copies that we have left, if we're ever told that there's some original copy from before the Renaissance, we don't really have it. So we have very little to prove any human activity before what we would call year 1000 now. And then of course there's a lot of things in deep history, but we just don't know. We don't have reliable dating methods. That's a big part of Fomenko's whole thing here in their first book, is that the radiocarbon methods and all of this is very inadequate, especially because they have to be compared to what we already think that object would have belonged to, right? If we don't already have a standard chronology with a rough idea of when the Roman Empire was and when this and that all happened in history, if we don't have that, then we actually can't judge our radiocarbon dating correctly, and people in the field itself know that it's not that accurate. There's a lot of intricacies to understanding carbon dating and isotope dating in general, and the short version of the story is it's not accurate, so we don't know what happened before 1,000 years. And here it's important to connect the Europeans, if we're speaking of Europeans versus the Tartars, West versus East, then we must also remember that the Europeans were largely Catholic. That's pretty much what we can use interchangeably as here as well. Catholic versus Christians. And the Tartar Empire was both Christian and Islamic before Islamic broke off itself. It's what Fomenko says, it didn't break off till much later, as late as the 17th century. So, what Fomenko is saying about the history of Britain is that it's actually a lot shorter than it's said to be, because there's so many duplicates, so many phantom people and events, so many phantom kingdoms. Now, the earliest chronicles that we do have of England are also dated to around the same period where we're saying history was basically being written. The Scaligerian mainstream version of chronology was being written, the 16th and 17th centuries. But much of that history was being written using books from a couple of centuries before, but definitely not as old as most people would think. Nearly all of our history books from anywhere in the world come from this period. And since there is so few manuscripts, these few books basically serve as the entire foundation of the whole concept of ancient and medieval English history. Now, the mainstream version has it that England begins with the Trojan War in the alleged 12th and 13th centuries BC, but 1,000 years is presumed to have passed between the Trojan War and the epoch of Julius Caesar, which is the 1st century BC, and this is usually regarded as a dark age. And the dark ages that we think of before the Renaissance, the one that came from Petrarch, was also supposed to have started after the Roman Empire fell, basically, right? And then there was a revival of the Roman Empire later. These are examples of the phantom duplicates of Rome itself and all of the leaders. They're saying it happened in deep antiquity, then again closer to the BC AD 0.0, and then again later on with the Byzantine Empire. In the chronological version by Scaliger and Petavius, English history begins around 60 BC, which they say is the year the British Isles were conquered by Julius Caesar. Historians recognize the fact that the first written evidence of this dates to 1 AD, the reign of Octavian Augustus, and the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle begins its narration with this year, the first year of the new era. Now, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle is actually a collection of several separate manuscripts, supposedly dating to different periods, but historians believe these to all be duplicates of a single original, and so they put them in sequence, and they only differ in the amount of detail they contain. So since they arrange them in parallel, it gives us the opportunity to compare different reports of events from that same year. And it is also possible that all of these separate manuscripts are actually different versions of the same original copy, the same original story. So this chronicle, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, it spans the time from 60 BC and the 12th century AD, as the last manuscript abruptly ends with the description of events that took place in the alleged year 1153. The Scaligerian history assures us that these chronicles were written around the 11th or 12th century AD, writing about events as far back as 60 BC, but they're not basing this on anything really. This is a mere hypothesis. It's presumed to happen in that order because it matches the Scaligerian chronology, which is taken for granted as fact. But other than matching it up to the Scaligerian version of history, there are no other published reasons for why they were dated in this order. This consideration implies all the events described in the chronicles to be dated correctly. If this fails to be the case, the dating of the chronicles shall change automatically. We must point out that the problems with reconstructing the true origins of said Old English chronicles are known quite well, and British historians speak of them openly. Now, Fomenko believes that the manuscripts were actually written in the 15th or 16th century at the earliest. But why are they dated to the 11th or 12th century? He believes the answer is simple. Since the chronicle ends its narration with the events of the 11th and 12th century in Scaligerian dating, the authors of the chronicle are presumed to have lived in that century. However, the events of the 11th or 12th century may have been described at a much later date. The author could have lived in the 15th or 16th or even 17th century. And the Scaligerian dating of the chronicle's text depends on the dating of events it relates, so it already had an idea of the events that happened in the same time period as events in the chronicle. But if it turns out that those events really took place in a different epoch, the dating of these texts, the Old English chronicles, will have to be altered. The fact that these chronicles use BC and AD datings speaks volumes of their rather late origin. It is common knowledge, even among the Scaligerian historians, that the chronology was only introduced in the late Middle Ages. Now, I'm not going to go through each of the oldest history books here, but Fomenko has arguments to be made that each of them come from basically the 15th to the 17th or even 18th centuries. We also see a parallel in the dynasties of Scotland and England. Of course, the whole standard history of Britain as a whole starts in 180, the conquest of Britain by Julius Caesar, a Roman general, and what we might say is Tartarian history would have happened after that, right? If the Dark Ages happened after the fall of Rome, and the people who wrote the standard history come from that European Roman Catholic Empire, then the influx of the Tartarians, the soldiers of the hordes in the Eastern empires, they would have flooded in after the fall of Rome. And of course that is what we see, although that only appears much later in the history books. Again, in the 1200s and 1300s is the Mongolian expansion, is what it's now known as. And since the Europeans finally re-defeated the Tartarians, or the Russians or the Mongolians, they finally defeated them in 1775, we have roughly a 500-year reign of this Tartarian Empire. So keep that in mind when we're going through history. Things that happened during Roman times and then after Roman times. You can expect many incongruencies since these histories are only written by one side of this. Now there is only a few other mentions of other Roman emperors visiting England. And according to the chronicles, no independent English monarchs, no independent English kingdoms had existed in any of the years between 1 and 400 AD. And Fomenko contends that the British Isles appear to have been part of the Great Mongolian Empire for those first 4 centuries. But those centuries are actually in the 13th to 16th centuries, so the 1200s to the 1500s. And there can really be a lot of confusion here if we consider that Julius Caesar was not actually a Roman general, but he actually did belong to an army of the Horde. Because of course, directly through that time, this is considered Tartarian time. And it was only in the alleged 5th century AD that Rome loses power over Britain in the official history. And that's when the first independent kings emerge. And remember, the Dark Ages did not always refer to this 1000-year period or 600-year period even. So we can assume a chronological shift here, that these events have been pushed backwards in time, they really happened closer to us, and that it's actually flipped around. The alleged Dark Ages probably happened after Tartaria fell, and not after Rome fell. It seems that there were periods of prosperity after Rome fell, and in fact in the standard history, a lot of what Rome is taking credit for is actually Tartarian accomplishments, or phantom characters that existed within the Ottoman or Turkish or Albanian world. By the way, Britain is often referred to as Albion in the old times. Fomenko draws several links to Albania, and some of the events that are described in the British Chronicles could very well have happened in Albania. If you do remember my Greek video, we can also make a case that it was an Albanian general who was actually the figure of Alexander the Great. And just because a story is attributed to a certain part of the world now, it doesn't mean that it actually happened there. It could have happened somewhere else completely. Now, I'm not going to go through the whole chronology of the kings of England and Scotland, but there are a lot of parallels between them, number one. And number two, there is a problem with them being written in direct sequence, right? One kingdom ends and another one begins. We've seen this problem as well in Egypt, where the list of kings is assumed to succeed one another, which stretches their timeline quite a lot. Whereas if kings could be ruling in one part of the country here simultaneously as another king is ruling another part of the country, that list of kings can no longer be considered in sequence, and that time period can compress significantly. So that can also happen here with England and Scotland and Ireland. So there are a ton of parallels between the history of England and Byzantium, or Rome, and the Horde. Like, there's very similar tales being told about all of these different empires and epochs, and even though they have different names in the history of England or the history of Byzantium, which again is called New Rome, which is Istanbul today, which I'm believing right now is the real Rome. Istanbul probably was the original Rome, and the ancient Rome is a projection of that, as is much of ancient English history. These are projections of conquests by the Horde and dynasties within the Horde. And the Chronicles of England actually refer to Rome and Byzantium more often than England itself. Now, England was not a unified thing until about 800 AD, so 400 years after the supposed fall of the Roman influence on England. And the rulers of England and Rome or Byzantium are remarkably similar in their lengths and the way they succeed one another. They basically seem to be phantom duplicates. So the history of England seems to be mostly made up, or incorrectly placed in England, but really based on Byzantine characters. It means that the true history of Byzantium was shifted backwards about 200 years into the history of England. Let's look at this portrait here that's presumed to represent Richard II of England. But this king looks just like a Byzantine emperor with an orb and scepter in his hands. Several of the old kings of England, we just have no lettering at all on many of their depictions and statues, and it's quite odd. Another problem, just like the Hebrew of the Old Testament, some cases we see have strings of consonants to represent names where we don't have the vowels or any corresponding punctuation that would give us hints about the vowels. So we often have to guess the names of things, such as King Henry III, from the inscriptions H and R. So sum all this up, and Fomenko believes that the history of England duplicates the history of Byzantium, or the Great Mongolian Empire of the 14th to 16th century. A 200-year period stretched out and repeated into different forms of the same stories, which we now call the history of England. The parallelism between English history and the Byzantine epoch ends in about 1327, which is about 100 years before the official end of the Byzantine epoch. So the first 400 years of English history in its Scaligerian version describes England as a Roman colony and relates Roman events for the most part. But Fomenko demonstrates in his revised chronology series that Roman history of this period reflects the real events that took place in the Mongolian Empire of the 13th to the 16th centuries. And the next 400 years of English history describe the phantom Rome and Byzantium, which would be the real Byzantine events of the 13th to 15th century. Notice this is overlapped. There's just different versions of the exact same time period displaced into the next period of English history. Then beyond that, from the years AD 830 to 1040, describe yet another phantom of Byzantium, reflecting real events that took place in Byzantium in the 13th to 15th century again. And this is once again repeated from the English history period of 1040 to 1327, which is again the year that the parallelism stops between England and Byzantium. Fomenko believes there are a few fragments of documented history of England, but these would refer to events no earlier than the 11th century to 12th century. And there's very sparse information all the way up until the 13th century. And English history as we know it today begins to reflect the actual events that took place in Great Britain starting with the 16th and 17th century, without any Byzantine or Mongolian elements. This is when British history actually takes on a character of its own, and is not a phantom duplicate of some other period in place. So how were Byzantine and Mongolian chronicles become part of the English history? Well, first we just have to disregard the Scaligerian chronology, and the answer becomes fairly simple. Starting in the 13th century, which is the Mongolian expansion, waves of crusades sweep over Byzantium. The Crusaders were avenging the crucifixion of Andronicus, or Christ, in Tsargrad. Remember, Tsargrad is Istanbul again. Rome, New Rome. Feudal crusader states of the 13th and 14th century are founded all across the territory of Byzantium and the neighboring regions. Their inhabitants were a mixture of all kinds of people, from Western Europe, Russia, and Asia. In 1453, Istanbul falls under the onslaught of the Ottomans, or the Ottomans, originally hailing from Russia, or the Horde. Byzantium is laid waste, and a large part of its population decides to emigrate. Many intellectuals and aristocrats flee to Europe or to lands more distant, including the British Isles. These refugees take the Byzantine historical chronicles with them as priceless mementos of their past. So, what happens? Constantinople falls. The people of Constantinople scatter all over the place. Those people take their histories with them to the new places that they land, and thus, a large part of the history of Byzantium, which would have been known through oral tradition and sparse writings, were eventually written down in these faraway lands that these people settled in, and their descendants either remembered these stories or had access to old manuscripts, etc. But this is precisely why we don't see an independent British history until the fall of Constantinople. Now, Fomenko contends that this same epoch of the 14th century, 15th century, marks the conquests of many lands, including the Western Europe, by the Ottomans and the Horde. Britain appears to have been conquered around the same time. The island of Great Britain becomes an imperial province of the Horde, whose local governors are subordinate to Russia, or the Horde, and the Ottomans. Now, after the passage of some time, the inhabitants of the insular Britain begin to write their own history. The new history of the ancient England gets written in the 16th and 17th century. This takes place in the course of the Reformation. And remember, there was lots of active rewriting of history in these centuries, particularly with the Romanovs as they defeated Pugachev and started to rewrite the Russian history. Now, despite the editing, there does seem to be some clues here that we can work with. I did mention Julius Caesar earlier, but Fomenko believes he could have spoken Slavic, and is likely to actually be Yuri the Tsar, a Russian, or a Khan of the great Mongolian Empire. If the city of London in particular, or the British Isles in general, were founded by the Mongols, or the Great Ones, in the epoch of the Great Conquest, of the Horde and the Ottomans in the 14th and 15th century, we should see clues of that, and we do see clues of that. The House of London was in the East Saxon Kingdom, and the East Saxon coat of arms, or the House of London coat of arms, has 3 sabers on it that look very much like the Ottoman scimitars and can be interpreted as Ottoman crescents. Crescents against red. But, from any evidence that we have, the medieval Saxons never used anything remotely resembling these Turkish weapons, and Scaligerian history reports nothing of the kind. Now, by 1700, the coat of arms of London has no scimitars or crescents anywhere anymore, but the red field remains. The explanation, of course, is that upon coming to power, the Romanovs commenced to wipe out the old Horde and Ottoman symbols from coats of arms and works of art diligently and systematically, and the Romanovian artists were known for transforming crescents present in many Russian coats of arms into boats and other curved figures, with the objective of purging the old state symbolism of the Mongolian Empire from everyone's memory. There are also Russian names within Britain, especially the area of Ross. Now, I have skipped so much from these books. Obviously, I always recommend reading them. And I did want to mention the famous King Arthur, which Fomenko believes is a reflection of the Horde that invaded the British Isles in the 14th to 16th century. King Arthur was considered one of the greatest rulers of the ancient England, and whose lifetime is dated to roughly the 5th century AD, had maintained relations with the Russian Tsar. And Fomenko actually believes the name Arthur to be a combination of the words Horde and Russia, as the name Arthur had initially been written as 2 words, AR plus DU, and the second one is translated from Celtic as black. So in this case, Arthur would translate to the Black Horde. Remember that Russia consisted of several hordes, white, blue, golden, etc. It is possible that the entire horde had once been known as the Black Horde in Western Europe, hence the name Arthur. If this were the case, then the legendary King Arthur could in reality have been a Tsar of the Russian horde. Likewise, the Knights of the Round Table are a famous component of this period of history, and they were presided over by King Arthur. These appear to be quite similar to the Horde Council, also known as the Cossack Circle. Remember that both Cossack and Tartar are words for soldier. The warrior circle. Fomenko believes that it is likely that King Arthur had never been a local English king. The legend of King Arthur reflects the memories of Russia, or the Horde, which had once conquered the British Isles. And this is why the Scaligerian history of Britain cannot find a proper place for King Arthur. His reign is dated to the Dark Ages these days, an epoch we know nothing of, and one that can house virtually anything. It was only after the 17th century that Arthur has been regarded as a legendary character. Okay guys, I want to wrap this video up, but I do want to mention that Fomenko believes Genghis Khan to be also a Russian figure named Georgy or Yuri Danilovich of Moscow. The great Prince Georgy Danilovich, Genghis Khan, who ascended to the Rostov throne in 1318. This character has several phantom duplicates in other periods of history as well as other times in Russian history. But it is Georgy or Yuri or Genghis Khan who initiates the unification of Russia, the unification of the various hordes. The old Russian coat of arms used to depict Saint George the Conqueror, who is not surprisingly probably just a phantom reflection of George, or Georgie, aka Genghis Khan. St. George, the founder of the Great Empire, the Mongolian Empire, the Russian Empire. In this book, The Issue with Mongols did go into significant detail on many phantom characters and battles that are said to have been taking place in one area, but yet the evidence suggests otherwise, just all types of jumbling within the Russian history, which is basically the Mongol history. As we explained, Mongol basically just means the Great, so it's referring to the empire itself, not to a specific type of people. And of course, the Khans and Caliphs and Tsars of history are completely interchangeable. Those terms are completely interchangeable because it's the exact same empire. And although there's so much more that could be said just from these books alone and from Fomenko's work in general, I think this is a good length of video for this series. I will continue reading Fomenko books. I just bought myself a whole bunch more, and I will continue to make these summary videos on them, so stay tuned for that. Make sure to check out my other videos. I've got quite a bit now on Mudflood and history and Tartaria, and of course Fomenko, as well as a whole assortment of other subjects on my channel. And I have other channels on health, food, and art. All of these links are in the description of the video. And for today, that's it, guys. I appreciate you. Until next time. If you didn't know, I do have a lot of reviews on my Instagram, @RyanAlexander, and my website, noticebooks.org. I'm very excited to announce my newest book, Everything the Government Does is Bad for Us. And you can get the paperback on Amazon for just $9.99, and you can find the video read-along version or the audiobook on my website, noticebooks.org. And all of my books, audiobooks, and links are available on my website, noticebooks.org. And if you want to see what is apparently my most controversial video that was banned from YouTube and BitChute, you can go to wagthedogtheory.com and view the whole uncensored version of the video. And I recommend downloading it if it is still there.